Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to talk about reusable flows. Now, this is a subject matter that I really believe will save you all some time in your flow building and just your overall maintenance with Salesforce. So before I jump into the subject, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm Dee. I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem about 13 years. My favorite subject is flow, if you can tell. And then also, my Pomchi is older than my Salesforce career. She will be 17 in June. All right, so what are reusable flows? There's some characteristics of it, but it's a very simple definition. So these are flows that can be triggered from other flows. They are also known as subflows, modular flows, invocable flows. I'm sure you've heard all of these terminologies. However, I'll most likely refer to them as subflows within this presentation. They accept inputs, you perform logic within them, and then the outputs would come into the parent flow that they are connected to. And the best part about this is you can think about this at all levels of flow building. No matter how long you've been flow building, this is something that you can start exploring. So let's jump into the flow types you're going to look for. So if you've never started using subflows at all, you may have been like me and went to flow types, looked for subflows, and did not see anything about subflows. This is when it was first introduced and a lot of conversation around it. So what you will find are auto launch flows. And these are flows that, of course, don't require any user input, and they run in the background. So you would use these as your subflows within your parent flows. And the other one I consider a reusable flow are screen flows. They're distributable. I've used screen flows across multiple objects, never having to really rebuild them. So I do consider those as well as reusable flows. So what are some of the benefits? Some of the benefits are around not maintaining duplicate logic. If you've been flow building for a while, you know there's probably some flows that you have built maybe similar structures in, but there's a lot of common logic that you end up having to rebuild over and over again as use cases change. Also, it makes the parent flows a lot cleaner. So if you are tapping into a subflow to handle the common logic that's within there, then you no longer have to have that as part of the parent flow every time. And then consistent behavior. So if you are incorporating logic within multiple flows, something changes, then you have to update. You may be introducing inconsistent behavior across the flows because you have to compare those. You have to make sure they run the same. And then, of course, it's more scalable. So this is kind of what would be behind a subflow. If you've never used it before, you'll have a subflow within the parent. So in this case, it's part of the default outcome. And behind that, you'll see all of this, possibly. And one thing you'll notice is there's not a lot of DML actions. You really want to limit those as much as possible because you don't want to hit transaction limits across your flows, especially if you're using this subflow in multiple parent flows. Let's talk about when and how to use these reusable flows. When you are considering them, there's a few things you should know when not to use them. And that is, if your logic is simple, non-repeated, there's no need to even explore the concept of the subflow. Just create the flow. Also, they're not available for before save flows, so something definitely to consider. And then anytime you run the risk of hitting transaction limits, there's too many variables, it's very context heavy, just not a good situation for a subflow. This should handle simple logic. Now, when to consider, you start to see patterns discovered. So not only is the logic repeated, it's not very complex, but you also start to see patterns across multiple flows. As I go through this presentation, I will show you a use case around that as well, and I'm sure you all could probably relate. Best practices. Okay. One thing that is important, especially with subflows, is that it handles one purpose. If you're going to reuse it and you have multiple purposes within there, you probably will start to run into a situation where you have multiple subflows handling nuanced situations, which kind of it goes against what their use case is for. And then if you're nesting subflows within subflows, you run the risk of hitting transaction limits because everything is added together within that parent flow transaction. So if you have 3 levels of subflows and it's within the parent flow, that's a lot of transactions that are occurring. And the other thing is you want to limit your variables. So there should be less than or equal to 3, somewhere around that. I mean, you can get into 4 variables as inputs for the subflows, but just be wary of that and start to consider, is this the right path to go? You want to also handle errors within the subflow. One helpful thing about that is it keeps the error messaging consistent. So if you are handling logic across multiple parent flows in these subflows, then whatever messaging comes out of the errors will also be consistent. Maintain a change log. That's always helpful, especially when you start using the subflow more often. It's important for everyone to know what's going on. And then testing. So when you're testing the subflow, but then you're also testing the parent flow and then testing everything together. Just make sure it all works before deploying. So just a quick checklist. If you're starting to look at your organization and want to understand, do you have any candidates for reusable flows? These are some of the questions that you can ask. I won't read through all of them, but feel free to take a photo. And it's something where it's just a quick start. It's not all the questions, it's not exhaustive, but something you can start looking at to see maybe there is a use case where I can try this out. So here's the use case. I had a situation where I was asked, I need, every time a record is created, I want to run a validation on the hierarchy. So I gathered all the requirements, I have all the details for it. Created it, ran really well for a year. Time went on, they said, we now want to do it on demand. So then that involved a screen flow with a button trigger. So I created that and put that same logic within that screen flow. Then they asked, can we schedule it as well? All of these are running, okay? But the nature of each of them running have different business use cases. But in the end, the scenario that running that hierarchy validation is the exact same across all 3 of these. And this was maintained for a while. Then they said, we want to change the logic of the hierarchy validation. That became the problem because now I have 3 flows I have to update, make sure they all work the same way, make sure they're tested across the board, all of that. It was a lot. So I introduced a record validation subflow. It took a little extra time as part of that project, but now I am able to deploy any changes to that logic much faster. I have one subflow running, and it is connected to the record triggered, the screen flow, and the scheduled flow. So any changes I have to make, I make to one flow, one deployment. So here is a checklist you can also use for building the reusable flows. That involves defining very clear inputs and outputs what's coming from your parent flow into the subflow, and what are the outputs that you will then be using within the parent flow. I like to use text variables or just very simple variables instead of record variables. I just find that it's a lot less constricting when I want to use it in other places. Also, bulkify when possible. So if you are, if within your parent flow, you are getting records, get all the records that apply, then pass those IDs or data to your subflow, handle it within the subflow, and then output the data that you need. And then, of course, I've already mentioned testing and isolation, and also with the parent flow, and then documenting, which is something we already do anyway. So let's go through a few business scenarios. So here, these are some business scenarios that you can probably do now. And one simple one is just an email notification. Maybe you send one out when opportunities are closed, leads created, any situation that is out there, you have an email notification. Within your parent flow is where you can identify the name of the template or under what circumstances that email should be sent, all of the logic that determines if this should be sent. But the actual sending, querying for that ID, for the template, all of those details can be held within that subflow. And you can use this across other flows. And whatever the outputs are, you can determine what you do with those within each parent flow. Next, these are also really good for agent actions. So as you are building your Legos for agent actions and such, what you want to do is build small flows for a single purpose that you can then build upon within your agent. The next one is something that if you make a subflow object agnostic, it also allows you to do things like owner assignment. And this doesn't apply to everything. So I had a situation where I was asked, can you assign to the person who owns the least amount of records or the fewest amount of records? And the way that you can do that is within your parent flow, maybe you query all the records that would qualify, get those owner IDs, put them into that subflow, go through all of the decisions to determine which one should be the owner, and then your output is the owner ID. So let's go through a few key takeaways. Move common logic into subflows. That's it. Go through your flows, go through your inventory, see where you're finding commonality. If anyone is asked for updates and you find yourself updating 3 or 4 flows, start to see where those patterns are to see where the commonality is and where you can move that out to a subflow. Also, build for user experience, maintenance, and scalability. And this is something I build for even outside of reusable flows. You want to make sure that the user's experience is consistent, and subflows definitely support that. Easier to maintain so that you can get more out quick, more fast. And then also that you can scale as the business scales. Design good inputs and outputs. So that goes back to the simple inputs and outputs like text and so forth that you're putting into your subflows. Why this is helpful is because it does not limit you when you start to use this subflow across parent flows. And then lastly, standardize the logic and error handling for consistency. So that's putting that error handling within your subflow, making sure that the same error is consistent each time. If it does come up, you hope there's no errors, but if there are, it's very consistent. And also the behavior is consistent. Now, I am not the first person to talk about this, and I definitely am probably not the most knowledgeable within the community. So here's some community resources that are very helpful and also help me through my journey and subflows and such. That's the list and the QR code to get there. I'll leave that up for a moment. Let me move out of the way. All right. Photos. All right. And the slides will also be available within the app. Just need it. So I want to thank you all for attending. Thank you very much. And if you would like to leave any survey for me, let me know. I would love to improve upon this talk for the future. And session summaries will be coming soon. Thank you.